You have lost weight, real weight. Your face is thinner, your arms are smaller, your clothes fit differently in the legs and hips. The scale has moved consistently for weeks, and your belly is exactly the same, maybe slightly worse, and you are standing in front of the mirror doing the math. Weight down, belly unchanged, and wondering if your body forgot about the middle part. It did not forget. Your body is making a deliberate biological choice. And after 50, that choice is driven by a hormonal logic that most fat loss content never explains. Today we are going to explain it. And once you understand why your belly is the last to go and under what specific conditions it finally goes, everything about your approach will change. But first, I need to tell you something that changes how you think about fat loss completely. Your body does not lose fat uniformly. It loses fat in a sequence that is determined by hormone receptor density across different fat depots. The fat in your face, your arms, your legs, subcutaneous fat, has relatively low cortisol receptor density and high sensitivity to the fat-releasing signals that a calorie deficit produces. It releases readily. It goes first. Visceral fat, the deep fat around your organs in your abdomen, has the highest cortisol receptor density of any fat depot in your body, which means it is the most protected fat you have. Cortisol, the stress hormone, sends a specific signal to visceral fat that says stay, hold, do not release. And after 50, when cortisol sensitivity in visceral fat has increased significantly, that signal is louder than ever. You can be losing subcutaneous fat from your face and limbs, while your visceral fat is receiving a simultaneous signal to stay protected. The scale goes down, the belly stays. Both things are true at the same time. Here is what is specifically happening in your body after 50 that makes this pattern so pronounced. And this is where it gets genuinely eye-opening. The first factor is the cortisol amplification that comes with declining sex hormones. As estrogen drops in women and testosterone drops in men after 50, the body's ability to regulate cortisol becomes progressively impaired. Cortisol receptors in visceral fat become more numerous and more sensitive, which means the same daily stressors that produced a moderate visceral fat storage signal at 40 produce a dramatically larger one at 55. Poor sleep, a stressful morning, skipping a meal, missing a workout. Each of these activates cortisol, and after 50, that cortisol is deposited preferentially into visceral fat at a rate that simply did not apply a decade earlier. You are losing fat everywhere else, but every cortisol event is simultaneously protecting and adding to your visceral reserves. The second factor is the insulin environment. After 50, insulin sensitivity declines across the board, which means the same carbohydrate intake that produced a moderate insulin response at 40 now produces a larger and more prolonged one at 55. An elevated insulin, even mildly elevated, keeps visceral fat locked. You cannot access stored visceral fat for fuel when insulin is elevated. The fat burning window is closed, and after 50, that window stays closed longer after every meal than it did before, which means even when you are doing everything right, eating clean, fasting, walking, your visceral fat is spending more time protected and less time accessible than your overall weight loss results suggest it should be. And now, the twist that most people never hear. The behaviors that are moving the scale, aggressive calorie restriction, high-intensity cardio, are the same behaviors that are keeping your belly locked. Here's the mechanism. Aggressive restriction elevates cortisol. High-intensity cardio elevates cortisol. And after 50, that cortisol hits visceral fat receptors with amplified force. You are burning subcutaneous fat through the deficit, but you are simultaneously telling your visceral fat to stay protected through the cortisol response your restriction and intense exercise are generating. This is why people who diet and exercise intensely after 50 often lose significant total weight while their waistline barely changes. The approach that moves the scale is actively counterproductive for the specific fat they are trying to lose. So what specifically unlocks visceral fat after 50? The first intervention is creating a consistent low insulin window through fasting, 12 to 16 hours daily, not aggressive extended fasting that elevates cortisol. A moderate fasting window that drops insulin consistently to the level where visceral fat becomes accessible. The low insulin window is the only time visceral fat can be released. And after 50, you need more of it, not because you need to fast longer, but because your post-meal insulin stays elevated longer, which means your fasting window needs to be protected consistently rather than occasionally. The second intervention is replacing cortisol-generating behaviors with cortisol-lowering ones. Walking instead of HIIT, moderate calorie deficit instead of aggressive restriction, resistance training twice a week instead of daily cardio, sleep protection above everything else. These changes do not just feel better, they change the hormonal signal that your visceral fat is receiving from stay protected to release available. And that signal change is what finally makes the belly respond. The third intervention is the one most people resist. rest. Eat more protein, 40 grams per meal, minimum after 50, because muscle mass is what keeps insulin sensitivity from declining further. And declining insulin sensitivity is what keeps visceral fat locked. Protecting and building muscle through adequate protein intake is a direct visceral fat intervention, not through calories, but through the metabolic environment that muscle mass maintains. Drop a comment and tell me, are you in this exact situation right now? Weight moving everywhere except the belly? I want to know. And if this video finally explained something that has been confusing you for months, subscribe.